Here, we're going to be looking at the Mosel, a region which is synonymous with German grape growing and winemaking. It's essential at the identity of German wine. I'm going to go through this part, which is the introduction and history. This is a free video. Other parts on this series for the Mosel will only be available to those of you who subscribe to the Wine with Jimmy Club. So German wine begins with the Mosel. We know that German viticulture was literally found in the ruins of a Romanic press house in Piesport, which is a German town. They date those seeds back to the 4th century, and that means we have evidence of some very old grape growing here in Germany. So where does the etymology come from for the Mosel? Well, it takes its name from the Latin word Mosella, and this is originally a Celtic Mosea, meaning the smaller river east of the Maas. The Maas River flows through France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The Mosel, also spelt Moselle in French and sometimes English, starts off in the Vosges Mountains at the border of Alsace, Lorraine, and Franche-Comté departments in France, and then makes its merry way east. Once it gets into Germany, it then goes for 144 miles northeast to go into the Rhine River at the city of Koblenz. That's 231 kilometers, by the way. And with this movement northeast, it has carved its way through these gorges, and you've got this wonderful meandering river with dramatic topography coming down to the river, which means you've got these terraces and these cliffs. You've got beautiful castles that litter the landscape and villages, but obviously dramatic vineyards here too. There are somewhat around 200 villages, towns, that grow grapes along the banks of this river. And Riesling is so suited to the Mosel. It really has an excellent ability to really transmit district, village, vineyard, plot, geology, all into beautiful wine expressions, including the slope position, the aspect, and of course, also the human touch as well. Now, we have around 8,500 hectares under vine. That's about 21 to 22,000 acres. And we have around 2,850 wineries, including around 1,900 estate bottlers. The average size of a vineyard is about 3 hectares, about 7.5 acres. And white production is very much what Mosel is about. 91% of the production. Red is just 4%, and pink is around 6%. And Mosel makes a variety of wine styles. There are large cooperatives like Moselland, for example, that makes very introductory style wines all the way up to single sites as well. And there's nobility here, like Weingut Johannes Jos Prüm, Maximum Grünhaus in the Saar area, that are very, very well known indeed. So there's your map of the Mosel going from that sort of French border, Luxembourg, all the way down to Koblenz. You see, it's that kind of mustard color on your map. It's yellow on this map as well. And the Mosel has very much been historically defined by its location at 50 degrees north. That means that we've always called it marginal. We've always called it an area that is on the very sort of periphery of cultivating a widespread volume of grapes. But of course, there is ambition, there's dedication, and sometimes desperation that would drive the growers to plant vineyards heavily staked on these very steep slopes that adorn the Mosel. So we find that, we'll talk about that in a future video. Several growers may work a single site. So there are several types of, say, Wehlener Sonnenuhr, for example. And one of the most iconic vineyards in the whole of Germany is found in the Mosel Saar district, and that is the Scharzhofberg, which is commonly associated to Weingut Egon Müller, but in fact, there are multiple producers that share the site and make wine from it. The Alleinbesitz, which means monopolies, are actually quite rare in Mosel. And really the styles we look out for in this beautiful landscape are fruitier wines, often with sugar. So there are lovely Feinherbs, Halbtrockens, and then of course a plethora of Pradeketzwein, such as Kabinett, Spätlese, Auslese, and of course even the noble rot-affected Birchenauslese and Trockenbirchenauslese. And of course, with the rest of Germany, there has been a movement to größer Gewächs, so single vineyard dry wines from Riesling and Spätburgunder, albeit at a slower pace than many other German regions. About 1/5 of the region's grape production is that Winzergenossenschaft of Moselland, that is the wine cooperative of Moselland. And there are also a couple of others as well, but that's the major one that we find. So as I mentioned, we have that maybe Celtic to Roman beginnings for viticulture. So we have sort of mythology, anecdotal kind of evidence that Celtic tribes were here, but the earliest convincing archaeological evidence is what I mentioned earlier with the Romans. The first Roman military camp was established on the Petersburg Hill in 30 CE. 13 years later, the emperor of the Roman Empire, that is Augustus, founded the city of Augusta Treverorum, which later becomes Trier. And it becomes a real significant military stronghold. Trier, actually, in late antiquity, was the capital of the Western Roman Empire. So there's a lot of focus here, spiritually and culturally. Archaeologists have unearthed lots of vine pruning shears. There's some really good archaeological maps you can find about the density of where we find these. Many of them are around places like Trier, Piesport, Brauenberg, Erzig, Erden, and modern calculations of the processing capacity in the ancient presses suggested that pretty much the Romans would have cultivated a similar production to what we find today. And the Romans liked the Mosel because of its ability to then transport because of the river. And then it goes on to a larger river, the Rhine, which gives you more access as well, more trade route. Next, and the picture there, by the way, is the Kaiserturm, which is the imperial baths at Trier. Of course, we then move on to the post-Western Roman Empire. So the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century meant that we then have the emergence of the church. So out of the Dark Ages comes the influence of the church, where wine was needed for sacramental purposes. So monastic viticulture expanded to fit that, but also to quench the thirst of the locals. So wine gained importance, as you know. And the oldest monastery in the Mosel is what you see here, Benedictine St. Maximum Abbey in Trier, founded in the 6th century. The largest landowner for over a millennia. So very much from the collapse of the Western Roman Empire through the expansion of Christianity and into the Middle Ages. Until the late 18th century, Mosel vineyards were typically co-planted like many of its sister regions. But in 1787, Archbishop Clemens Wenceslaus of Saxon, the powerful electorate of Trier, started a new direction. he announced something called the Rieslingsedict, and he decreed that his subjects were to plant good vines, and that was your Riesling. Then we have Napoleonic conquest of German territories to the west of the Rhine. So this is in 1794. The Mosel Valley then becomes a French department. Monasteries and convents were not very widely cared for by Napoleon, of course. Many were seized, they were nationalized, and the vast holdings were auctioned off, mainly actually to raise money for many of Napoleonic campaigns across Europe. So the purchasers of many of these estates were wealthy families, nobility, and of course, generals who were in favor of Napoleon. A couple of years later, the French started to map the landscape out, and their cartology of the region would create a framework for the future classifications. They noted actually that Brauenberg, Piesport, Wehlen, Zeltlingen, Urden, and Grack were all villages notable of high quality. And it's very, very true today that all of these are exceptionally well known. French rule did not last too long, and as we know, Napoleon's cause came to an end in 1815. But we still have the impact and the legacy of secularization and Napoleonic laws of inheritance, which meant that you had that fragmentation of the landscape. So we have the end of Napoleon in 1814-15. Mosel, like many parts of Germany, falls under Prussian control, and actually there's a brief period of prosperity at that moment. But we then have the customs union coming into effect by the Prussians. Tax and custom policies, along with a lot of poor harvests, absolutely punished the region. And we know this because the German philosopher Karl Marx was born in Trier in 1818, and his family had vineyards and suffered at this time. So this meant that there were lots of critiques of Prussian rule, and thousands of Mosel growers and Mosel inhabitants at this time emigrated to other places. Now, wine was difficult to cultivate at that time, and there was a gentleman here called Ludwig Lambert Gall, who was living around that time, but further into the 19th century, who was a social reformer to improve the plight of Mosel grape growers. Now, he encouraged them to add a sugar water solution to pre-fermented grape must, which would hopefully dilute the high acidity and make a more palatable wine. This is called Galisierung or Galisation, and it was used for decades by the grateful Mosel growers. So many people started to take note of this, though, and they did not see it as an improvement eventually. And this really gave birth to what's called the Nature wine, which is wine made without additions, and really being one of the forerunners for the likes of VDP associations or the Charter League in the Rheingau, for example. We then have the Clotten map being produced. So this is Sturerat Clotten's map of the Saar and the Mosel, first printed in 1867-68. It was commissioned by the Kingdom of Prussia and went with Otto Beck's book titled De Weinbau an der Mosel und Saar, Viticulture in the Mosel and the Saar, published in 1869. The Prussian tax authorities used the revenue figures of the different Mosel vineyards from the time span between 1816 and 1832 to set up property taxes. And Clotten originally ranked the vineyards into 8 tax brackets based on the net income, including yields, labor costs, not just the quality and the price of the wines. There were 8 classifications, but it was deemed too complex. These were simplified down to 3. They're on that map you see there, from highest to lowest, dark red, light red, and then sort of an orangey beige color. Some of these sites that were so well known from this time was the Scharzhofberg, the Maximilian-Grünhauser Absberg, which is today called the Herrenberg. These were dark coded on that map, and also hillsides like Grünhausberg and Schatzberg as well. Further on the history, in the 1870s, the Mosel was linked to the rest of the newly unified German Empire by railways and roads, and therefore we have this collective rise with trade and tourism. And also Trier starts wine auctions, which really starts to give a limelight to Mosel production. This later would become known as the auction rings that remain an important feature of high-end German wine market. The state established domains in Trier and on the Saar as model operations with experimental and educational components. We have merchants setting up shops in places like Koblenz, Traub and Trabach, and also Trier. And of course, Riesling starts to gain the momentum. In 1879, it was 42% of the Mosel. In 1908, it had more than doubled. And vineyards were spreading as well. Wine from the Mosel, called Modevin, was fashionable, and it would be in places like Berlin, Bordeaux, London, Paris, New York, and you name it. But of course, there are difficult times ahead. Phylloxera first appears in 1907, but doesn't really take root because of the loose slate soils. Okay, that's not too bad. But then we have the issues around 2 world wars and one very damaging regime. Under the Nazis, most of the Mosel's leading wine merchant families, many of which were Jewish, were persecuted or killed. Those who could fled to other places. In 1945, the vineyards were in crisis. There was limited cellar space, equipment, and there was no workforce. Apparently, there was not enough intact wine barrels to actually suit the 1945 harvest. But there was an economic miracle called the Wirtschaftswunder of the 1950s and 60s, which saw good consumer mass production within Germany. Lots of pictures of it there on your slide. And traditional mixed agriculture farms narrowed their focus to grape growing and planted high-yielding varieties, of course, the likes of Müller-Thurgau and Elbling. Wineries rushed to churn out production at this time. But you've got to remember, at these times, it was colder, wine production was harder, and there were some difficult times ahead. In the sugar shortages of wartime, post-wartime Germany, there was a demand for sweet wine production. And sadly, by the 70s, cheap sweet Mosel wine had become a regrettable signature. And by 1985, a few producers were found guilty to have raised the perception of sweetness and body by adding diethylene glycol into their wines. This is called the antifreeze scandal of West Germany and also Austria. And because of this, German sweet wines lost their domestic and export markets overnight. Of course, it's much stricter today and quality is fantastic, but it was a difficult couple of decades following that. And as I mentioned, there has been a movement towards dry production. It's albeit slow, but it is happening. Now, why? Well, it's difficult to cultivate the ripest grapes in Mosel because it's one of the coolest locations. So really, the climate and also growers were not ready to deliver dry wines on the scale of like you'd find in the Rheingau, in the Nahe, the Rheinhessen and the Pfalz. Plus, there was a global red wine boom, and that meant that Mosel was literally out in the cold. Mosel continued to produce really great off-dry and sweeter wines, but they did start the dry production as well. And today we have about 25% of the Mosel being dry. Now, the Mosel is in a challenging transitional place because it is very difficult to cultivate the landscape in comparison to places like, say, the Pfalz, for example. So its difficulty, we need to really club behind the region. A couple of key producers to mention. I've already kind of mentioned these guys, but these are the Müllers of the Saar district in the Mosel. So this is Weingut Egon Müller. You'll see the first, second, third, and fourth there. There is a fifth as well. So all the men have called Egon. So it's Egon Müller. But where they lack for creativity on namesakes, they make up for it in wine. Egon Müller the fourth, on the far right-hand side, I'm not going to say the far right, is the Wein Kaiser, a man who really transcends not only this wine region, but his country. Twice the winner of the Golden Vine's Best Fine Wine Production in Europe 2021-23, as voted by 1,000 fine wine professionals from 120 countries. It's a good argument to say that actually Egon Müller IV is making probably some of the finest wines in the world. The 2003 Scharzhofberg Riesling Trockenbeer and Auslese went under auction in 2015 for 12,000 euros for a bottle. If you would like to treat me to one, please give me a call. The estate was founded back in 1797 when a Müller ancestor, Felix, took over the vineyards from a local monastery during the aftermath of the French Revolution. It was initially called Bien National, but then was renamed Scharzhof by Egon Müller I, named after the Scharzhofberg vineyard, also a village. They had 8.5 hectares at this time. Records then indicate in 1909, all landowners with holdings in the Scharzhofberg agreed to something which is called the purity requirement for wine from that plot. That means there are specifications around what you can do with no adulteration or blending. This means that there was a keen awareness from very early on from this site for high quality. And it was Egon Müller III who laid the foundations for high quality of wine after the Second World War, which his son Egon Müller IV then perfected. So we have this Egon Müller chain of great producers. Today they have 28 hectares of the Scharzhofberg. In total, they have 8.5 hectares on the Scharzhofberg. Other key producers on the Scharzhofberg are von Volksem and Rixe von Kesselstadt as well. And a final producer that we should mention is the J.J. Prums of Wehlen, one of the most iconic producers and firm traditionalists. They date back to the Mosel to 1150, but it was J.J. Prüm who established the estate in 1911, and Johann's son Sebastian who carved out the distinctive style of Prüm wines in the 1930s. In the late 60s, on the left-hand side, you'll see the great Dr. Manfred Prüm, who took over the production and raised it to one of the finest quality estates in the Mosel. And they have then remained devoted to the idea of unchaptalized Prädikatswein. In 1842, the Jodocus Prüm erected large Sonnenuhren or sundials in the vineyards of Wehlen and Zeltlingen to give the villagers and vineyard workers a sense of time beyond just the ringing of the bells. They're wonderfully carved. You'll see a picture on your screen there. The southern exposition of the sundials suited them equally to reliable timekeeping. And there are several hundred of these now across the Mosel. The most famous would be Wehlen, Zeltling, Brauenberg, and Urzig. J.J. Prüm today has sites in Wehlen, Bernkastel, Grach in the Middle Mosel, and 90% of their vineyards are ungrafted, in German, Wurzelecht. They have the jewel of their crown would be Wehlen and Sonnenuhr, which is very steep on Devonian slate and beautiful Rieslings. On the right, you'll see Katharina Prüm, who has took over the reins from Manfred in 2003. Phenomenal wines produced by an iconic producer. That brings me to a conclusion. Join me for part 2, where I talk about a shorter video on grape varieties. If you want access to this video, plus all the other parts on this Mosel series and all other exclusive Mastering Germany videos, you'll need to click on the link in the description to go to the Wine with Jimmy Club, a monthly subscription service where you'll get lots of extra goodies for just $3.99 a month. And if you do have any comments or questions about your favorite wines from the Mosel, maybe you love JJ Prüm, maybe you've had Egon Müller, maybe you're willing to share a bottle of the 2003 Trockenberg and Auslese with me, then please do get in touch. It will be fantastic to hear from you. Dankeschön. Goodbye.